This is a review of how to solve quadratic equations using the square root method. To solve quadratic equations using the square root method, you cannot have a linear term. So that means you can have a quadratic term and a constant term, but you cannot have a term that just has x to the power of 1 in it. Typically, we can use that to solve equations like x squared minus 25 equals 0. Now we talked about before in a previous video that you can actually solve this by factoring because this is a difference of squares. So I could solve this as x plus 5 times x minus 5 equals 0. Set each one of those factors equal to 0. And then I get x equals negative 5 and then x equals positive 5. So I can get two solutions by using the factoring method because that is a difference of squares. However, there is another method that we could also use, but we do need to be careful. We have no linear term, so we are allowed to use the square root method. The square root method that requires, first of all, that you identify what is being squared, and you get that by itself on one side. So that means I need to move the negative 25 to the other side. So that gives me x squared equals a positive 25. Now I'm allowed to take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is x. The square root of 25 is 5. However, you notice that on the right side, using the square root method, we only obtained one solution, positive 5. But when we solved exactly the same equation using factoring, I got negative 5 and positive 5. So in order to capture both of those solutions, I have to put a plus or minus in front of the square root. So we actually do get plus or minus 5, so we get both solutions. Typically, we use this method when we do not have an option of factoring. So typically, we use this method when we do not have a difference of squares. So in order to solve 4x squared minus 3 equals 0, I have no linear term, so I am allowed to use the square root method. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to identify that the squaring is applying only to the x, not the 4, and also not the 3. So I'm going to add or subtract first. I'm going to add 3 to both sides first. I end up with 4x squared equals a positive 3. And then I'm going to divide both sides by 4. So I get x squared is equal to a positive 3/4. Now I'm allowed to take the square root of both sides, and then I do not want to forget to put the plus and minus in front of the square root. I want to obtain all possible solutions. The square root of x squared is x. I get x is equal to plus or minus. I would like to simplify my answer as much as possible. So I will separate the square root of the top divided by the square root of the bottom, and I will simplify any square root that I can. So here I get square root of 3 divided by the square root of 4 is 2. So I get square root of 3 divided by 2. And those are my two solutions. This problem is almost the same, except the 3 and the 4 are switched. But watch what happens when I simplify. I will bring the 4 to the right-hand side, so we get 3x squared equals a positive 4. I will divide both sides by 3, and I get x squared equals 4/3. Now when we go to take the square root of both sides, we will still put in the plus or the minus, but when we simplify our answer, we want to be careful. X is equal to plus or minus the square root of 4 divided by the square root of 3. The square root of 4 is 2, but the square root of 3 doesn't simplify. However, we know from previous courses that we do not like to leave a square root in the denominator. We like to rationalize. So I will multiply the top and the bottom by the square root of 3 to get rid of the square root that lives in the denominator. So I get x is equal to plus or minus 2 times the square root of 3 divided by 3. For problem number 3, I want to identify what is being squared, and that is only the x. I want to get that by itself. In order to do that, we will subtract 4 from both sides. So I get x squared is equal to a negative 4. Now when I take the square root of both sides, I still want to put the plus and minus, but notice that underneath the square root here, I end up with the square root of a negative number. The square root of a negative number is always going to generate an imaginary solution. So I will take the square root of 4, which is 2, and the square root of a negative number will always attach an I. These are what we call two imaginary solutions. Now it's time for you to try a few problems. Pause the video and see if you can get the correct simplified answers for these three problems.